So first, a note on the terminology. You'll have seen that I've slightly changed the terms in the title. And that's because I think there's an increasing sort of worry around the popularity and the mainstreaming of the term decolonization. And even when it's not being used purely strategically, that there's a worry that there's a real dilution of the term and a danger of it being used as a metaphor for other endeavors, important as they might be, such as diversity and so on. And I want to take that kind of worry very seriously. And the Tuck and Young piece that I've put here is a key sort of text in that debate. And I'm very happy to then come back to this discussion afterwards. I also, however, want to hold on to the idea behind decolonization. And here I take inspiration from my colleague Radhika Govinda at the University of Edinburgh, where she talks about decolonization as a way of disrupting the ways in which white bodies have privileged relationships to land, labor, and what counts as knowledge. And at the same time, what I want to discuss today is very much inspired from both decolonial and post-colonial scholarship, but as well as activism and practices that attend to the ongoing coloniality of our global order. That is the power dynamics established by colonialism and imperialism that continues to be alive and well within our current global and local structures and processes. And it's important to note here that I very much consider myself a student of the scholarship, and this talk really doesn't come from a position of expertise. Rather, it's an exploration of the ways we might want to think about this in bioethics. And I also recognize that the ways I present this will, of course, have its own gaps and biases. Now, this talk is also, although I've been thinking about this for a couple of years already, but it's also developed in response to the statement issued last year at the World Congress of Bioethics by the organizers in the wake of George Floyd's murder, police brutality, and the renewed Black Lives Matter protest around the world, right? So the need for bioethics to attend to the legacies of colonialism, slavery, and the dramatic historic power imbalances that still shape research and practice in medicine, healthcare, and bioethics. I've just taken bits from the statement here. This is not the whole statement. But what I'm proposing today is not a new niche area of bioethics, but rather a real, slow, and sustained shift in the core ways we think about, teach, and do bioethics. And that includes medical ethics, research ethics, public health ethics, global health ethics, and also law in this area. And of course, it's a huge topic. And what I'm about to say might be pertinent to some area more than to others. But I do hope to start a conversation around this with you. So I'll be exploring some of the ways we can start thinking about this by focusing on what I've called 3 C's. Bear with me. So I've called them concerns, concepts, and the canon. And again, it's very important to know that a lot of this work is already being done. And it's more of a question of, and here I'm adopting the idea from bell hooks, that it's important to bring to the center the kind of work that is still very much done at or perceived to be belonging to the margins. Now, I said I would talk about 3 C's, but of course I must begin with the 4th C, which is the all-engulfing feature of our current lives, Corona. And if it's not too early to say that, the emerging lessons from COVID-19. We've been talking about the fair allocation of ventilators and vaccines, surveillance, liberties and lockdowns, the ethics of vaccine passports. We've talked about and written about the vulnerability of those living in care homes, those caring for them, whether it's right or wrong to open up the economy and when, and it's absolutely right to be talking about those things. Yet, we have also witnessed the ways in which the virulence of COVID really lies in its ability to follow the fault lines in our society. So COVID-19 has disproportionately affected and afflicted, racialized, and minoritized groups in countries such as the UK and the US, in terms of mortality, but also in terms of socioeconomic impacts from the lockdown and recession, a burden that's also fallen on the shoulders of minoritized populations within predominantly white contexts. And it's done so in a way that was entirely predictable, of course, to those familiar with social determinants of health and the effects of structural health and social inequalities on well-being. In the US, for example, Black people were dying at the rate 3 times higher, in some places 7 times higher than the white population. In the UK, the minoritized groups have been disproportionately exposed due to their roles in certain occupations. That's the case, of course, in the US as well, as health and social care workers, hospitality workers, warehouse workers, as nurses, auxiliary nurses and assistants, taxi and bus drivers, chefs, security guards, plant workers, and machine operatives. And several of these occupations, of course, lack job protections and benefits, secure pay, sick leave, all the reasons that make it difficult to self-isolate. Now you add to this overcrowding in housing, increasing the risk of household transmission, which also partly explains the additional mortality among older South Asian women in the UK. But of course, this also doesn't neatly just fit along the lines of socioeconomic disadvantage. A survey by the British Medical Association in April 2020 found that 64% of ethnic minority doctors had felt pressured to work in settings with inadequate PPE, compared to 33% of doctors who identified as white. So in order to start really making sense of what's going on and even beginning to think about the ethical implications, we have to start engaging with concepts that we don't normally use in everyday bioethics. And to be honest, not enough, even when we're referring to social determinants of health. And these are concepts and notions associated with structural racism, with institutional racism, and the idea of racial capitalism. So the way in which capitalism and race are inextricably interlinked and dependent, and that both have matured in the concept of European colonization. And it's only by understanding that both racism and coloniality are part of our structures, institutions, norms, processes, and cultures, that they're ordinary parts of these aspects of our lives, that we can begin to shift our moral lens towards how to attend to these concerns. So the 2 main arguments in my talk is first that, if we can really talk about arguments for this talk, the first is that an attention to social justice must be central to all of our moral concerns and moral imagination in bioethics. Our thinking about health, well-being, flourishing also must contain deeper and systematic understanding of inequality and oppression. And the second is that we must do so with a better and clearer understanding of the world as it is today. And that world is deeply racist and steeped in coloniality. So now moving on to the 3 C's. The first one is concerns. And I'm just going to come out and say it. We have a very unhealthy relationship with emerging technologies in bioethics. And I say so, and I hasten to add rather, that some of my best friends work on the ethics of emerging technologies. But this is true for what we fund, what we think about, and what we teach in bioethics. And this is a point that was made earlier this year by Rachel Fabi and Daniel Goldberg in a paper. But this is also not to diminish the importance of thinking about the ethics of tech. I think especially when it comes to the power of data and AI, I think we should be concerned and worried. But also I think part of our focus really needs to shift on systematically thinking about how these new technologies reinforce existing patterns of racism, misogyny, domination, and oppression. These authors here have done a very powerful job in unpacking this, but also looking at better practice in this area. And Ruha Benjamin, who's written Race After Technology, reminds us also early in the book that we must understand race itself as a kind of tool, one designed to stratify and sanctify social injustice as part of the architecture of everyday life, which is then reproduced through technology. The other unhealthy relationship we have is with abstraction and generalization. And this is, again, a very important piece, I think, by Commissioner Russell. Not I think it is by her, but I think a very important piece. And this arises from our disciplinary tradition rooted rather in analytic, moral, and political philosophy. And the ways in which we are not enamored by abstract principles, universality, objectivity, impartiality, and so on. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't think about universality, or that there cannot be some overarching consideration or even generalization, but I think consistently we tend to start from the wrong place. I think, again, if we start with the world as we find it, we need to focus on disadvantage, suffering, violence, and silencing as it is happening today. And in that paper, Russell suggests, and I quote, "I suggest that the experiences of people of color be shifted from margin to center, engendering shifts in bioethics from rights to justice, from consent to collaboration, and from competence to humility." And she's not the only one among colleagues in bioethics calling for this. But even talking about justice is not enough. Even when we think about justice, I think traditionally we tend to be focused on distributive paradigms. That is, moral questions about the proper distributions of burdens and benefits in society and the distribution of resources. Even when it comes to issues such as access to healthcare, we need to go deeper, as Young says here, to what lies behind the distributive patterns, behind social determinants and health inequalities. So just to take a couple of examples, if we're thinking about access to healthcare, we need to dig deeper in our structures and institutions to consider why, for example, race-based differences continue to persist in the referral for life-saving treatments. For example, Black patients are statistically less likely to have heart specialists assigned to them when they need them. And this is from the US. Or why maternal death rates are 5 times higher for Black women in the UK. The answers will lie somewhere in our clearer understanding of structural, systemic, and institutional racism. You might also have followed the recent events around a podcast that was posted under the auspices of JAMA, which was supposedly on structural racism, which has now been removed with an apology by the editor-in-chief. A slight pity, this might have served as an excellent teaching point about what Charles Mills, critical race theorist, calls white ignorance. But of course, I agree that the harms caused by an ignorant and uninformed views expressed in the podcast greatly outweigh any benefits that might have arisen from leaving it online. A final example of our sort of the shift needed in our concerns. When we think about the ethics of regulating abortion, for example, we often, especially when we teach it, we often tend to go back to questions of moral status of the fetus, the rights over one's body. And this is what we find in the classics. So if we go back to Thompson or Hirschhaus and the way she compares the different kinds of theoretical framings and so on. But what we don't do is that we don't start with the puzzle that's historically and currently women with privilege have always faced fewer obstacles to accessing termination. This was true when the Abortion Act came in place, and this is true now. And it is true globally as well. So, for example, during the Zika outbreak, when states and public health bodies warned women against getting pregnant due to the impact of microcephaly, without so much as a nod to the lack of access of contraception and termination in those contexts, as colleagues Deborah Dinnis and Florence Luna and others have pointed out, Zika and the scare of microcephaly wasn't an issue for women of privilege. They lived far away from the dirty waters that were breeding grounds for Zika, but also accessing abortion was never an issue. So those who are most affected by restrictive regulation with regards to abortion, for example, are always socioeconomically disadvantaged women and women of color. Why is that not our starting point to think about reproductive health and access to abortion? My colleague Ariane Chavisi also has written very nicely about how the global gag order, for example, regulates access to contraception for women across the world, which is really under the control of a handful of handful of men, essentially American presidents, who will make these huge decisions about the reproductive rights of women around the world. Now, if we move on to thinking about concepts, if we're going to do anti-racist bioethics, we need to engage with the concept of race. And the concept itself cannot be separated from its racist and colonial origins. And we have to look at how, and the ways in it problematically continues to be deployed in science and medicine. Again, several authors recently have engaged with this. I mentioned Kamisha Russell's work earlier. Alana Lentil's book is particularly illuminating in this area as well. And among other key points that she makes early in the book, and that others have made, the problem with racism when it's focused on individual cases of racist behavior serves to label it as an aberration, the bad apples in police brutality, for example, rather than what I called earlier business as usual. Again, she cites here Charles Mills, who talks about the problem of relegating racism to the margins, which then results in a profound lack of racial literacy in the public sphere. And this has been true in how we've been talking about race in the biomedical sciences as well. And although there's been so much discussion about that, the fact that none of the notions that we have around race really correspond to any sense in what might be characterized as biological or medical differences, and this has been shown again and again, race realism is still very present in many discussions around genetics, and so much of the data and the science is almost retrofitted to race. And Sayani talks about this in her book, and I quote, she says, "The data, the theories, the facts themselves are rotated and warped until they fit into a racial framework we can relate to." And what's interesting is that both from the perspective of those who do racial science, whatever that is, but also if we look at what appears to be non-racist endeavors, so things like quest for personalized medicine, or even more the calls for more justice-based movements around representation and inclusion in research, have in some ways continued to reinforce this race realism. And in the context of biomedical research, this has led to what Epstein, I think, has called the inclusion difference paradigm. So the inclusion of underrepresented group in clinical trials also serves to reinforce the idea of difference between groups, and continues to contribute to the slippage between what we think are biological differences and versus social identities. And on the question of inclusion and representation, it's particularly interesting because in Fisher's book, for example, she shows how when we talk about healthy participation participation of healthy subjects in research, they're often typically recruited from Black and Latinx community, and they're often serial participants because this presents a significant portion of their income from these trials. And so there is, in some sense, overrepresentation in research. And so some of the discussion led Angela Ballantyne and myself to sort of talk about what to us was really troubling around the recent calls for participation in clinical trials for the COVID vaccine. So there was a lot of talk from a variety of researchers and public speakers about the need for including minoritized and Black populations within the trials. And so in this piece, which is very small, it's a commentary piece, we're not arguing against inclusion, but we do say that if we want to take inclusion seriously, this really has to happen at all levels, from decisions around funding and what will be studied, to ensuring that the benefits and the results really reach populations whose interests and needs have been underrepresented. And just a call for participation in specific kinds of trials is not going to do that. And so if we really take this shift around what we concern ourselves with, this leads me to think that we potentially need to move away from those kinds of concepts that we often jump to when we do a new topic in bioethics. So questions around autonomy, liberty, harm, privacy, interest, best interest, rights, virtues, duties, consequences, and to take a step back and to try and access other kinds of concepts such as power, marginalization, domination, exploitation, relationality, but also concepts around community, solidarity, and so on. But in order to do this, of course, we have to do some thinking about the canon. And again, this is not just about, and this was I was referring to also in the Tuck and Young piece at the beginning, this is not just about diversifying our reading lists and our citation practices, although we absolutely must be doing that as well. But I think we have to be much clearer about the purpose of our diversification. So if you know a little bit about Edinburgh, you might know that we're having a particularly interesting and animated public conversation. I mean, interesting in the British sense, of course. Animated public conversation about whether, in fact, we are in the process of cancelling Hume. I think that's partially, for us at least, I think that's a bit of a distraction. I think what we need to do is to decenter the scholarship. So my potentially controversial point here is that even if we consider the foundation of our field of normative bioethics to be moral and political philosophy, whether we must or should refer to racists and colonialists such as Hume and Kant are not that relevant for an applied domain like ours. Philosophy didn't start with Aristotle and didn't end with Rawls. And it's to think that a handful of white men would hold the ultimate key to the cornerstones of morality is, of course, incredible, right? So just to give you an example, I've been using the trolley problem as a thought experiments with my students for well over a decade now. And of course, every time I put it to them, they will come up with questions around the moral weight of consequences, understanding about maximizing of good, the understanding of the moral status of acts versus omissions, even when they haven't watched Michael Sandel's very popular seminars on the topic. But they also often ask, but who is it that's going to die? Who is on this track versus the other? Who is this person that's pushed over the bridge? And often I kindly but firmly steer them away with the excuse that this being a thought experiment and can you please follow the rules of the game and so on. But I think they're right about the importance of not abstracting at times, of not generalizing, of specifying who we're looking at, who is going to be affected by our decisions, right? So I wonder what happens to bioethics if we think about justice and fairness, not from the perspective of the veil of ignorance, but from the lens of intersectionality, for example. So starting from the understanding that social categories and social identities like gender, race, class create interdependent and overlapping systems that result in specific experiences of injustice. And Crenshaw, of course, is famous for coining that term. So for the sake of justice, when we think about the canon, we must move away from those who have overly occupied our epistemic platform and steered our thinking about ethics and obligation and responsibility and so on. So what if our starting point in thinking about justice and health was the health of undocumented migrants or the health of indigenous population in occupied lands? That is the health of the colonized rather than the colonizers. What would bioethics look like then? The relevant scholarship exists and it's always being added to. It requires us to become students of ethics again and to be able to build this new canon. So where do we go from here? Again, as I said, the possibilities are immense, and several scholars, and these are some examples, have laid the foundations for us. But again, we must keep attending to whether the approaches we are embracing really advance our understanding of racism, racialization, and coloniality. I think the feminists have done an immense job in showing us the ways in which social justice can be at the core of our moral thinking, the ways in which our moral thinking should be informed by the world as it is lived and experienced by embodied beings, by bringing our attention to social structures and the ways in which power and privilege, as well as domination and oppression, continue to be reinforced by those structures. And importantly, the ways in which we also must reflect on our own positionality, on our own standpoint, which I believe much of the traditional canon really lacked. And Kirsty Dotson, for example, suggests that one way to do this is to look at Black feminist scholarship, which reminds us that we're not just embodied, we're also gendered, we're also racialized. And we must continue to learn from disciplines beyond moral and political philosophy. And of course, bioethics is particularly in a privileged position when it comes to that, because we have a tradition of interdisciplinarity. And we already know how to communicate and learn from other disciplines. The other thing we might attend to is the epistemic, and sort of bring our attention to how our Eurocentric and therefore colonial modes of knowledge production, moral, political, legal, and the kinds of injustices this has led to. Understanding that both race and gender are heavily colonial notions. And that leads, and the scholarship that leads to us thinking about which voices are heard, which concepts and theories are given a platform. And this is very apparent in the work of race theorists, of decolonial and post-colonial feminists. Some examples here. We must also, I think, engage with history much more rigorously, both in our research and our teaching. So, and this cannot start and stop at Tuskegee or Guatemala or forced sterilization in Puerto Rico, or even a handful of prominent eugenicists and eugenics policies, although those absolutely cannot be let slip from our collective memories. We have to see them not as isolated historical incidents, but the ways in which they are repeated again and again. And Harriet Washington's work here is really important in this field. And it's only when we do understand that it's an ongoing problem that we start to understand where the distrust lies when we look at things like vaccine hesitancy in the context of COVID, but otherwise as well. The justified distrust of the medical establishment. And so here are some of the scholars who have been working around this, some of whom I'm very lucky to call my colleagues. Several special issues have been coming out on the topic of racism and health and bioethics. And along with Angela Ballantyne, Keisha Ray, and Ariane Shavisi, we have another special issue coming out in bioethics, hopefully in the coming months, that looks at the various ways we can engage with racism, with scholarship on racism in health and bioethics. And finally, I think there must be a renewed attention to the global. So even leaving aside current questions around vaccine nationalism, I think the rate at which the COVID vaccines were developed were both a marvel and a tragedy, because it makes me wonder what it is that we need to be doing so that the other issues that have been killing people all this time can get the same kind of attention. But I think there's not enough nuanced discussion, even when we're doing what we think is global bioethics. There's not enough reflection in the ways in which our concepts and concerns and canon, again, continue to other people in the global south, for example. We see ourselves in the global north as being the center, everything else in the periphery. We also do not want to necessarily learn from what we call the global, and we see that in our responses to how other countries in the global south, for example, have dealt with COVID-19 versus our own countries. But also, aside from COVID, other topics. When I look at the discussion around the surrogacy reform in the UK, there's very little discussion of what we might have learned from the global south or global surrogacy or other jurisdictions where this has been done, especially if those countries are poor and from the global south and former colonies and so on. And this is also quite prominent in the ways we discuss, and I'm always struck by this when I teach every year about, for example, autonomy. When I teach on autonomy and I talk about autonomy in the context of surrogacy in the global south, and the ways in which my students respond to the autonomy of us here in the UK, for example, versus poor brown women elsewhere. And I think we're really doing them a disfavor by ourselves not engaging more fully with our own perspective and our own biases and our own kind of understanding of what counts as autonomous and so on in that context before we even begin to teach those topics. So I think to conclude, I just want to say that I think what we need is a period of introspection and reflexivity, of unlearning and re-educating ourselves. And I don't really know where we're going. As I said, I'm very much a student of decolonial and anti-racist scholarship, but I have some thoughts around what we should be reading, and that we should continue to be in conversation both with those who are undertaking this work in bioethics, but also in other fields. And that includes those who are trying to, who discuss, for example, decolonizing the university, decolonizing global health, decolonizing anthropology, and so on. So I'm just going to leave you with this. And thank you very much. And over to the respondents.
Many thanks. Many thanks, Ago. A wonderful, thought-provoking talk, reducing me to silence, and reflection on how we teach and how we approach both medical law and bioethics in what we do. And there's lots to learn from what you've said. So before we open it up to Q&A, I'm now going to turn to Lindsay. Are you online?
I am, yeah.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Yeah.
So would you like to offer your response?
Sure. I want to say thanks for that talk in the first place. I mean, now is the time, right? I mean, hundreds of years ago was also the time, but now is the time, because we're having these discussions about disparities in health outcomes and COVID, and they're actually happening in the press, not very well, but I think this is great. I think this is striking while the iron is hot. So I tried to, I got your notes a couple of days ago on this, and thank you for that. And I tried to make notes for myself about what I wanted to say, and rather a lot of them just say yes, yes, yes over and over again, which is not all that interesting. So I'll just say a couple of thoughts that I had that also might not be that helpful, but anyway, they're what I was thinking about. So you described mainstream bioethical approaches as abstract in general, and I think that was Kamisha Russell who you were quoting on that, and that seems right. But the other thing, I think I'm quite a spatial thinker, so the other thing that I was thinking is that it's not just that they're abstract in general, it's that they're small. They're really little. It's health that's happening inside the skin of the individual, or at best health that's happening inside the four walls of the clinic. There's no connection to the outside world in the way that you're envisaging. So the kind of reform that you're articulating represents making the inquiry very much bigger than it is, kind of massively bigger than it is. And then I have to admit, I woke up at 7 o'clock this morning and went to my computer and Googled what is bioethics, because I suddenly had this worry that, is this even the same disciplinary practice that exists in mainstream bioethics? If we take up this reform, which by the way we absolutely should, obviously, but are we even playing the same game anymore? And then I wondered why that makes a difference, and I thought it might make a strategic difference, and it might make a psychological difference. How do we think of ourselves engaged in this enterprise? Are we doing bioethics only better, or are we eclipsing it with something that actually does what it says on the tin? Because it seems really clear, and you've done such a nice job of presenting it, that mainstream bioethics, in some real sense, doesn't do what we imagine we're doing when we do it. It doesn't speak to the aims that we think it's speaking to. Yeah, so I don't know whether that, maybe that's useful for the discussion. I'm interested in thinking about what the heck is bioethics after hearing your proposal, but more than that, I'm interested in thinking about how to adopt the practices you've described. So thank you.
Many thanks, Lindsay. And I should have said you are a Vice Chancellor's Fellow and a member of the Centre for Health, Law and Society at Bristol. So, and that, am I right in thinking that your current, is it PhD research, is focused on philosophical, ethical and policy issues around drug use and harm reduction as well. So I suppose these sorts of issues are, I suppose, broadly relevant to sort of understanding sort of how you engage with bioethics across a range of areas, of which this may be one. So, and I think there's very pertinent questions. They're broad, but no doubt Ago may have some thoughtful comments on that. So I want to thank you for offering those comments. They're much appreciated. And so now what I'll do is I'll hand it over to Ian to make his comments, and then Ago, if you can come back again after that with any thoughts you may have. I've opened up the chat box now if people have any questions. Otherwise, just say you'd like to speak, and I'm more than happy to sort of pose the question after Ago responds to what Lindsay and Ian have said. So, but thank you very much, Lindsay. Much appreciated. Okay, over to Ian Bressington, who's a senior lecturer at the Centre for Social Ethics and Policy at the University.
Are you frozen?
Oh, we've lost Anne-Marie.
Sorry, I'm back. I shall go and sit on the stairs a little bit closer to the router.
I think we've lost Anne-Marie as well, are we?
Right. Okay. Am I audible now?
You're fine.
Okay, right, good. So, right, so you get a grand tour of the house as well. Okay, so thanks for that. That was a really, really rich talk. I've got pages and pages and pages of notes in increasingly illegible handwriting, so I'm going to try to sort of come up with some vaguely coherent narrative. And I think there's a lot there, again, as with Lindsay, that I was thinking, well, yeah, that's kind of right. But there's also quite a bit where I was thinking, I want to make some kind of a defense of the tradition, of the analytic philosophical tradition. You kind of knew I probably would, didn't you? So, right, what order do I want to do this in? Okay, so basically you made a lot of play about the importance of justice as a kind of a normative, or a fairly central part of normative bioethics. And the question that was sort of nagging away at me was what you mean by that. So, I mean, you talked about the Iris Marion Young point, and I think that's absolutely true about the way that it's informed by our social structures and that kind of stuff. And I guess one obvious response to that would be, well, sure, but even someone like Rawls is aware of that when he talks about the circumstances of justice. He's a little bit more crusty, perhaps, but he's talking about the same kind of stuff. And so that kind of led me to think about slightly more widely in terms of, and it speaks to Lindsay's question about what bioethics is, and it has to do with a question about the role that abstraction plays as a means of making true claims. So the thought here is, if you're going to make a claim about what is just, or what justice requires, or something like that, then you need some kind of at least tolerably stable account of what justice is that participants in the debate can accept as being true, or at least plausibly true. Otherwise, we are all talking about different kinds of things. And to that extent, then we do need some degree of abstraction, and we do need the kind of what I used to think of as being sort of fairly sawdust chewing analytic philosophy. But actually, I think it's increasingly important, because it forces us to get away from individual claims to something a bit more abstract. So I was the two sort of lines that I was thinking about was the famous Marx quotation about how the philosophers have sought to understand the world, but the point is to change it. To which my response is increasingly, yeah, but you're not going to change it unless you understand it. Similarly, in the Genealogy of Morals, going back to my slightly more wild continental philosophy days, Nietzsche talks about how there's no seeing that's not perspectival seeing, and how there's no knowing that is not perspectival knowing. And I think it's quite tempting to treat that as a call for a kind of opening the party quite wide, which it is in a sense. But even there, he's expressing that as a kind of problem. There is a problem for perspectivism to be overcome. So in calling for extra voices in a given debate and extra perspectives, it's largely so that we can whittle them away again. It's on the understanding that they're all talking about something in a slightly different way, but they are all talking about something that is, there is a true claim to be had somewhere. So this seems to me to mean that it speaks to the advocacy academia distinction. So it all comes down to why it is that the claims we make are worth taking seriously, whatever they may be about, and that is presumably because they are true, or because they are at least an attempt to grasp what is true. In which case, when we start talking about decentering, and I will get to the point, I am coming to the end now. When we're talking about decentering, I guess there's the slight worry might be that, well, you can't decenter everything. Because otherwise you just get cacophony. And some of the voices in that cacophony will be interesting and plausible, and some will be, to use a technical term, mad as a box of frogs. And you need some kind of way to sift out what is persuasive, what has normative heft, what has a chance of fitting onto the world as it kind of is in its own right, and so on. So there's the worry would be, I guess, from this slightly more cynical perspective, like, well, you at least need some kind of center around which you can orbit. And we can talk about whether it's the right center, and we can worry about, you know, whether it turns out to be, you know, Ptolemy or Copernicus or whatever. You can shift that. That's fine, but nevertheless, you do need something to kind of get you onto the carousel in the first place. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with lots of people talking about what's going on inside their own heads at a given point, rather than there being any sense of it, of an attempt to correct anyone. So that's kind of the thought that was sort of nagging away at the back of my head, in terms of, you know, what we mean when we talk about justice, or when we talk about the importance of things like power and vulnerability and solidarity, you know, those concepts that you said we needed to pay more attention to. And again, presumably you think it's true that these things are important, or that we need to bring them more to the center. In which case, either you end up talking about things being true for Ago and true for Ian and true for Lindsay, in which case you're not really talking about truth at all, or you're talking about things that being as they are, in which case the problem would be, well, don't you need some kind of attempt at objective analysis? You know, and that's kind of what analytic philosophy, when it's at its best, is trying to do. However imperfectly it might do it in practice, that's the game we're all trying to play. So that's kind of my slight defense of the tradition, by which I'm going to include slightly weird, you know, I think I would want to be fairly open-minded in terms of who gets to play, sure, but there are still rules of the game, because if there aren't, then what are we doing? So that would be the worry. So yeah, I'll shut up now, thanks.
Okay, many thanks, Ian, for your thought-provoking questions. So you've got a combination of questions put to you there, Ago. Would you like to respond?
Yes, I would like to say maybe a couple of brief things, maybe before we open up to everyone, because I think they're really interesting. And thank you both so much for engaging with the talk in such depth. It really means a lot. I mean, one of the things that you brought to address is, you know, what's bioethics, and that's absolutely the question I tried to avoid answering in my talk, right? That and to a certain extent, it's an act of cowardice, and I totally take that on board. But it's also because I want to open up what we think we're doing when we're doing bioethics, and by doing bioethics, I mean the very applied kind of bioethics, what it is that we're doing. And I'm really following here sort of what Powers and Faden say, for example, and what you alluded to as well, Lindsay, and talking about we really need to explode this to far bigger considerations than we have so far. And they talk about the sort of going beyond the spheres of justice, and not just talking about health when it's health and other things and so on. So in the same way, I think we cannot understand what's going on with inequality, with suffering, if we don't open it up to beyond what we think we're doing when we're doing bioethics, right? So I think that's absolutely needed. And that's needed to really understand the small things, right? So the point I was trying to make about Black maternal mortality, for example, is that this is happening now here in our very small space. What is going on? And to understand what's going on, we have to go back to what went on, 200 years ago and so on, and the ongoing coloniality of it, right? So that's sort of a partial answer to that. Again, I'm happy to come back to some of these things. And with Ian, I'm not trained as a philosopher, as you know, but if there's anything I care about in bioethics, it's the analytical stuff. It's the only thing I understand a little bit, right? And I'm very keen. So maybe I brushed over this too fast. So what I don't mean is that we shouldn't have generalization and abstraction, right? However, that's not where we should start. And before we get to where we think we need to get at, we need to hear the many other perspectives before we get there. And so maybe I can give an example of a recent sort of learning curve I was on. I started writing a paper on sex selection and global sex selection back in 2012. And the paper, when the paper, if you look at it in 2012, was very much sort of rehearsing some of the usual arguments we get in bioethics around sex selection. And then when it eventually went to a the paper and the reviewers, I had a very, very rigorous but very critical reviewer who said, you're saying things like, this is what we should worry about sex selection, but yet when we look at sex selection in India, these are the ways it's been misunderstood and so on and so forth. And you say it's important to bring in the voices of the global South. I do not see the voices of the global South in your paper, right? And then I went back and forth, and I had to really do that kind of hard learning around what it even means to engage with post-colonial scholarship around this area. And there's massive amounts of literature around this from the post-colonial perspective. And I tried to do that a little bit in the paper. And I think what it did to my paper was it did not actually change the perspective I have on sex selection, which is ultimately a perspective from gender justice. And I think it's universal. I don't think that it applies differently to the UK than it applies to India, for example. It is definitely a general argument about sex selection, but it's, I think, massively changed by combining the post-colonial voices within that. And even somebody like Mohanty, who's often sort of interpreted as arguing for more kind of relativistic position, says that she's not against the idea of transnational solidarity, that we are working with an idea of what it means to achieve, or to think about gender justice, for example, in that context, but that we need to hear the realities of the context and the voices that come out of those contexts much more in doing that before we start to do that generalization, right? So I'm all for the abstract and for the generalization. My social scientist colleagues hate me for it, I think. But I think we're not doing a good enough job in all the considerations that we might take into account. And when it comes to justice, what I mean by justice is attending to systematic patterns of disadvantage, right? So, and there I think just very plainly, Young is right, Rawls is wrong. Elizabeth Anderson is right, Rawls is wrong. And that's sort of my really cheeky answer to a very complex question that you posed.